program explores complex financial crimes and their global impact. The views expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of the producers and/or the host. From boardroom decisions to shadow banking, from Wall Street to the dark corners of the internet, this is From the Hill to the Trenches, the search for justice. I'm your host, Dorothy Hill. As a former Goldman Sachs associate who has worked in 5 countries, including Germany and Japan, trained in compliance by a former agent of the FBI, and advised both global banks and government agencies, I've witnessed how money moves through legitimate channels and shadowy networks. In this podcast, we investigate the world of financial crime, otherwise known as fin crime, compliance, and the pursuit of justice. We talk to the insiders, the regulators, investigators, compliance officers, and occasionally the reformed criminals who understand how financial systems can be exploited and protected. From money laundering to sanctions evasion, cryptocurrency schemes to corporate fraud, we follow the money trail and examine the human impact of financial crime. Whether you're a finance professional, work in compliance or technology, or simply care about transparency and justice, join us as we navigate the complex intersection of money, power, and accountability. This is From the Hill to the Trenches, the search for justice. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of From the Hill to the Trenches, the search for justice. I am joined today by our esteemed former FBI agent and U.S. Army veteran, Brig Barker. I will introduce Brig shortly and just wanted to let everyone know that we welcome all of your input. If you have ideas for a podcast guest and or are interested in sponsorship, just go to www.hill2trenches.com and you will find a contact us form on that page. There's also information about the blogs that pertain to elder financial exploitation, which we did in episode 1 with my esteemed colleague and friend, Chuck Harold, who is former LAPD. So take a look at that podcast, video, YouTube, listen to it while you're in the car, in between meetings, when you have a chance. And please like, subscribe, and share the YouTube channel, again, Hill to Trenches. So we will proceed now with Brig. And thank you, Brig. Where are you today?
Well, good morning, Dorothy, from northern Georgia. I'm here in a remote cabin near the Toccoa River. So we're here for about a week, hanging out in the forest, and it's beautiful.
That sounds lovely. We have just experienced a major heat wave here in New York, and we're coming up to another heat wave. So first of all, happy 4th of July to everyone who is listening. And actually, by the time we broadcast this, we will have gone through 4th of July celebrations. Just stay safe, everyone out there. And let's get started. So as we mentioned before, we have many esteemed guests on this podcast. I had reached out to Brig actually via LinkedIn and determined that he has many interesting and salient aspects of his background in his career that would make him a really great guest on the show. So I'll let you introduce yourself, Brig.
Sounds good, Dorothy. Yeah, again, thanks for having me. So kind of my journey started in the Army after college. I was an Army officer for 5 years, stationed in Italy for 3 of those years. I was the 82nd Airborne, used to keep a unit over there in Italy. And so I had the amazing privilege of being over there and jumping into foreign countries, and did a tour of northern Iraq at the end of that back in 1991. And following that, I did a career in the FBI. I started out in violent crime, working Los Angeles, working bank robberies, working fugitives, kidnappings, those things. And then 1998 happened. We had the al-Qaeda bombings of our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. So I got to go over there with an FBI tactical team And that was my introduction to terrorism. And after that, I spent the rest of my career, about 18 years, working al-Qaeda and ISIS, and then retired out of San Diego, and then had my own private company. And I've done a number of things since then. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Great. Well, thank you for, first and foremost for your service to our country. I'm just curious, do you recall the Al Qaeda incident at Valley of the Kings in Egypt in the late 1990s? Were you involved in that in terms of investigating that?
Yeah, I am familiar with it. A friend of mine was over there as the FBI attaché at the time. And then after 9/11 happened, a lot, many people in the FBI went and did things, investigated the case. Of course, 9/11 was an investigation. And I actually got on a plane, went to Cairo. And so I worked the 9/11 case from Cairo, Egypt for a few months. So I was over there and kind of fell in love with Egypt, but at the same time, very busy. We had a lot going on, as you can imagine. But yes, I am familiar with that situation.
Yes, it's truly a beautiful country. And I first visited Egypt in late 90s and was really amazed with the level of U.S. investment, in their infrastructure and various projects. So fast forward, here we are in 2025, Brig. We're facing a plethora of threats, both here in the United States and also around the globe. We are definitely looking more deeply at some of the hotspots. And since the podcast involves money laundering investigations, fraud, and corruption, why don't you take us through some of the highlights and work that you're doing, including your appearances on, major mainstream media such as Fox?
Yeah, so the landscape right now with terrorism in particular, and that's always been kind of my realm, is very interesting right now. I think we're in a new world. I'll say a new realm, given what happened with Iran recently. But we do have 4 years where we had an open border, and we're dealing with that now. But that brings, having run a couple joint terrorism task forces in the U.S., they're never bored, those task forces. But right now, we're trying to figure out who's in our country, and so that's a apolitical statement. We are trying to figure out who's here, what the threats are, and things like that. The jihadist threat will continue. That's not going to wane at all. But given the kind of the latest situation with Israel, Gaza, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, these different groups of Houthi rebels in Yemen, it's a very frenetic, situation right now. And I always, people always ask me about Israel, Gaza, things like that. But when I look at that, I look at the external operations. I look at the external threats in whatever country around the world, because with the jihadists, especially like fence sitters, when they see anything happen with Israel, that prompts them to move to action. And so that's one of my main concerns right now. And then I'm also sitting at the intersection of this world of terrorism, of intelligence, counterintelligence, but also AI, which I'm all in on AI, Dorothy. I'm AI first. I use it all day long, and I think it's critical to make sure that we're keeping an eye on the good and the bad with AI. So that's kind of wave tops 30,000 foot of where I'm sitting at this point.
Excellent. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, AI is such an important tool. We're actually going to have an episode on the formation of AI. We started at my alma mater, Dartmouth, and we'll trace the development of that and some of the efforts that we're making in the New York financial-based community on what we call ethical AI. So the regulators of banks, for example, are struggling with how it's used. It is used definitely in the KYC, know your customer, and various parts of the client onboarding and transaction monitoring processes. We'll definitely delve into that on latter episodes. You mentioned a term, and we will be putting together a glossary for our listeners and viewers called a fence sitter. Can you please explain what that is?
Sure. So again, my realm was about 18 years working Al Qaeda and ISIS and homegrown violent extremists. And so, and I interviewed, I at one point, someone asked me, like, how many of these jihadists have you interviewed? And I counted up about maybe 500 to 600 of these. So I sat in the room with these folks, and I was always trying to determine their level of radicalization. Did they just kind of step onto that road? Are they pretty far down the road? Who are they being radicalized by? And are they getting ready to potentially be triggered into action, right? That's all is our concern. And so there were always these folks that were kind of not sure if they were all in committed, or, if they thought it was just, interesting experience to have with 3 or 4 other people, right? So the fence sitter is someone who is kind of wobbling. He's sitting on the wall, he's watching things. He's just not sure if he wants to move to action or if he wants to sit in his, extremist ideology and never do anything. And so the fence sitter is the one that's, watching media, watching things that are going around, geopolitically. And so we're also concerned about them, because one word or one media, piece can cause them to move into action. And I'll just mention with radicalization, because I was so involved in it, interviewing these folks. I also saw that it was always unpredictable what would put somebody on that road of radicalization, but the road itself was always very predictable after working for about 10 years. But the trigger to action was always unpredictable. We never knew what would cause that fence sitter to actually do something. So that's really kind of what I'm talking about there.
Absolutely. If we delve just for a moment into the root causes, were you able to identify during your tenure at the FBI what the root causes are for such activity? For example, is it based on poverty? Is it sort of unresolved childhood trauma and or neglect? Is it sort of a cult mentality that these individuals really weren't exposed to any other way of thinking? What is it exactly?
Yeah, great question. We could probably spend weeks, talking about this. But the studies show that poverty actually is not a factor. I mean, we have, doctors and lawyers and judges and all these folks, that come from those backgrounds that get involved with jihad. And I'll say, based on my experience, the majority of Muslims will never become jihadists. There's a small percentage, and we need to understand those folks, right? We need to understand their mindset and their ideology. But some of the triggers to step onto that road of radicalization, a lot of times is a sense of belonging. It's almost like gangs, Dorothy. The kid on the street, in a bad neighborhood, and there's this group of folks, some guys, some teens, and he feels like a loner, and he gets a sense of belonging if he joins the gang. So a lot of times, we see that. We also see historic familial ideology that leads them into this. So if you look at Muhammad Atta, the lead hijacker from 9/11, the Egyptian, right? If you look at his family, his father, you can see that probably kind of the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, can also lean a child or a teen or a young adult into that radicalization as well. So sometimes we see that. And then we also just see grievances. So, we'll see, someone in the Middle East and their cousin is killed, by whatever government, and they have a visceral reaction to that, and they want to do something. They want to avenge that, and so they will start looking for opportunities to join a group like al-Qaeda, ISIS, something like that. So there's a number of different kind of impetus that would push them into that. But there's very common ones as well.
Yes. I mean, the FBI has done stellar research in terms of cults, whether it's a cult based in California, where individuals are motivated by financial aspects and or even in some cases sort of like a sexual belonging, larger international group, like, for example, that John figure down in Brazil. That's a fascinating case we may go into. In terms of what's going on here within our borders of the United States, I mean, we hear daily about criminal rings that are being broken up. For example, today on Long Island, there was news that broke that a woman in her 20s, and I don't know her nationality, was arrested for being the ringleader of a sex trafficking ring that was run out of Suffolk County. For those of you who don't know where that is, that's the eastern section of Long Island. So she had allegedly, I'll say that allegedly because it's an arrest at this point, placed ads with her team to bring women into the United States, and two of those victims for sex trafficking were from Spain. So this case involves like multi-jurisdictions and obviously international borders being crossed. So in our view, after having discussed it with friends of mine in NYPD and retired NYPD this morning, their view was this should be investigated and prosecuted at the federal level. She got a slap on the wrist. We're not being strict enough about it. Obviously, over time, they're going to delve into the financial money laundering aspects. But they've known about this criminal network for over a year, Brig, and they just made an arrest. So if you take that small, so what I call like in our backyard on Long Island, sex trafficking arrest, and you expand it to look at the type of criminal activity that goes on all around the globe, what would you say are the FBI top priorities other than tracking terrorist cells and activity that expand into, say, narcotics trafficking, sex trafficking, and money laundering? What are those top areas of focus for the FBI?
Yeah, Dorothy, I think first we have to just say, anything that crosses a border, whether it's a state border or a country border. I was in a two-person FBI office for 4 years, and I sat at a police department. We didn't have money for an office, and so I sat at a police department with detectives, and they would constantly come to me with cases that would cross state lines and or cross into other countries, and so that's where we got involved. So I would take that case and go to a federal prosecutor and say, "Hey, is this something that we can prosecute?" And we start looking at Title 18 USC codes, for potential prosecutive charges. So that, kind of crossing the borders of any kind really is where we're looking. So counterterrorism will always be the top, priority with the FBI, I believe, because it's such a serious threat. It's an external operation from, these large terrorist groups. But beyond that, I don't know what the current per website, per FBI website, what the priorities are, but it's always the international side. So the counterterrorism from these international groups. Then you have counter-espionage, which is critical. So something maybe from China, Russia, wherever it may be. So terrorism, espionage. And then beyond that, we're looking for anything that is really kind of a group or, organized crime or anything like that. And then I think it kind of trickles down from there. So I worked gangs, at one point. I worked Persian organized crime at one point, again, crossed borders into Iran. And so I think anything where, the local police, they have to start calling other departments, and they certainly don't have, except for NYPD, don't have, entities located in foreign countries like Brazil. That's where the FBI kind of steps in and can prosecute those. The other thing I'll mention is any crime against a U.S. person outside the U.S. is FBI jurisdiction. So I worked a number of, kidnappings, in Africa and different places just because there was an American that was kidnapped outside of our border. So the FBI will always get involved in those.
Yeah. So, for example, and most people don't know that, yes, there are FBI agents who are housed within consulates and embassies overseas. And even NYPD assigns individuals to be based in London and work on an international collaborative basis with the local law enforcement there. That really helps our sharing of data, whether it's Interpol, which is based in France, or some type of exchange. We definitely need to do more in terms of that collaboration and having staff in those different countries of high risk. We're looking now at APAC, like what's going on in Southeast Asia. When I worked for Goldman in Japan, I would often travel to Hong Kong. And now, because of the political change of the status of Hong Kong, it's, a little more difficult. However, it's not impossible for us to think about the use of our federal resources and, again, increasing that collaboration. So we have industry organizations such as ACAMS, Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists, again, ACAMS, and then also ACFE, Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. And what I noticed last week when I was in Nashville is that ACFE is really making a strong effort and push to expand chapters in countries in Africa, Asia, etc. That's really important because the more people you have trained and certified in money laundering investigations, in analyzing forensic evidence, and also on the fraud side, the better we will be as a collaborative global community to, again, share data, work on investigations cross-border, and then really work, again, together to take down those networks. The issue we have with AI, and I'm interested in your thoughts, Brig, is how do we, as that community of fraud investigators, money laundering investigators, and prosecutors, et cetera, how do we stay ahead of the criminal syndicates who are also very savvy in using AI?
Yeah, Dorothy, I think, and I was AML for 3 years full time, and big fan of ACAMS. Got my CAMS, certification, and learned so much through that process. But I would almost say we can't not get involved deeper internationally. I remember early on in my FBI career, we had one agent in Paris who covered all of Africa, right? And then we had one agent in Athens who covered the Middle East, And then when I retired, I had worked in, I had opened up our attaché office in Sierra Leone, ran the Blood Diamonds investigation there, opened our office in Tunisia, and I had worked in Kenya, Uganda, Botswana, about so many years over there. We had folks all through Africa, and it greatly helps. It's just like when I was in Cairo after 9/11. Taking in leads on the case, and we were there and able to work with the host nation services. Just it makes it so much more robust in your present to be able to do things right. So for AI, we have to look internationally. It's just like money laundering. We have to be tracking all this. And as far as investigators and analysts, you have to stay up on the trends. You have to be tracking, what is the latest trend for moving money here offshore to this location, to the Isle of Man, whatever it is. We don't do a great job of that, I would say, in AML. You've got to do a case every 3 days, or, it's kind of, especially if there's a consent order, we just got to keep pressing. But we don't necessarily, and I'm not, attacking any particular bank or institution, but we need more of that professional development, I think, to be tracking like what you're saying. I think that's a great idea. And I think those conferences help out.
Absolutely. One of my client projects was working for an Asian bank for the U.S. subsidiary, and we did what's called a Fed look back on transactions. So that's Fed as in Federal Reserve. And what our team had to do was look at trade finance and really delve into the aspects of commodity pricing and all the different legal entities that were involved in a single transaction of, for example, shipping wood from Indonesia, right, to the state of Oregon, and you'd be amazed at how many entities are involved in that. So the shipping industry is also another area we'll be delving into in terms of investigating fraud. I wanted to go back to your comment, Brig, about all of your amazing experiences working in Africa. And if you're not able to answer the question, I understand. What is the role of the CIA in those types of investigations, and how closely does the FBI work with CIA agents overseas?
Yeah, so it's evolving, to this day. That again, the FBI wasn't overseas necessarily too deeply, before Director Louis Freeh said we need to be overseas, and so I was part of this push out, where we started sending agents out, and we were trying to figure out, like, how do we work with the country team in an embassy? How do we work with the CIA? How do we work with the State Department? How do we work with the ambassador? With this kind of, strange, entity body that's now in the embassy. I worked deeply with the CIA, and every embassy is very different, and every country is very different. They, have certain mandates as far as, intelligence work overseas. They try to proactively monitor what's going on in these countries. And we worked symbiotic in some countries and not so symbiotic in other countries. We also have better levels of intelligence sharing in certain countries and with certain people than others. And so it very much depends. I can tell you that in embassies in general, based on my experience, it's kind of one anymore. Like we all know we're working against certain threats, but there's also different priorities. So when I was in one West African country, I had, my priority was, a certain investigation where, an economic officer with the State Department, they were out trying to do something. USAID was out doing something else. And so the ambassador has a tough job. He's trying to keep all this together, keep everybody working together, monitoring everything that's happening to include the CIA. I worked in the embassy in London. That was a very different experience, both the mission, but also with the CIA there. So it really depends on who you're working with, what country it is, and what the mandate is within the embassy.
Did you find that working in smaller offices meant that you had to wear more hats? And could you give us an example of that, please?
Yes. So, you're always somewhat working at the behest of the ambassador, right? He's in charge of everyone that works in the embassy, the consulate, like you mentioned. And so, I loved working in smaller embassies. Like, I think of Sierra Leone was very small. And again, there I was working the Blood Diamonds case. In North Africa, I was working in a smaller embassy, unaccompanied embassy. My mandate really was counter-terrorism there. I love that. But when I worked in the bigger embassies like London, you're kind of going off, what is the crisis of the day? And so there can be what's called mission creep, where this is what I thought I was supposed to be doing today, but something is going on. There's a protest group in front of the embassy who's, lighting the American flag on fire. And, somehow I probably need to be involved in this with the regional security officer. So, but I love the small offices because I could really kind of be focused on what I was advised to do from FBI headquarters.
Yes. Did you, in your journey, whether it was in the military or FBI, like ever work in some of the countries, for example, Malaysia and Philippines, where there are like terrorist cells? And the reason I ask that, it is very difficult for those of us in money laundering investigations to really get under the hood and into the operations. I was just curious about those two particular countries, Malaysia and Philippines.
I did work cases with the Philippines. I know, and in fact, I was talking to a friend of mine this week about how I was kind of introduced into the PI and some things that were going on there because I had some cases there. I never worked in either of those offices. I was always Africa, Middle East. I'm an Arabic speaker, so I was always, on that side of the world. What I did notice is that we've had some really great FBI agents working Asia. I will say that most of the countries I worked in had active terror cells. When I traveled, and generally I would travel by myself to work in these offices. I didn't, the FBI's budget wasn't great to send two people, so they'd send, one person, and I didn't have a lot of infrastructure. I was, kind of big borrowing and stealing from other, folks in the State Department. Hey, can you help me out with a vehicle and a phone and, those kind of things. But I definitely was trying to, travel, go to meetings, meet with the National Police, things like that, amidst, active terrorist cells. And so, that in addition to all the other challenges working in a foreign country, especially an austere country, is where I spent most of my time. You're very limited on what you can actually get done.
I can imagine. You mentioned Arabic language. I'm curious to learn how long did it take you to attain fluency?
So, Dorothy, it's an interesting story and a sad story all at the same time. So I took Spanish in high school and I didn't get any of it. And in fact, I remember the Spanish teacher yelling at me, like, you're just not understanding. I couldn't even conjugate a verb. And so I went to my first Arabic school, and I went to 6 total immersion schools where there's no English. You have labs at night. It's a pretty intense experience. But I went to my first day at Arabic school, and there was 25 FBI agents. And we walked out of there. We were going back to our hotel, And I was like, this all makes sense. Like every bit of it just makes sense. I love this. And everyone else was like, that was the worst day of my life, you know? So I loved Arabic. It just for some reason made sense. And so I took Arabic because I was working terrorism and I wanted to deal with al-Qaeda, deal with ISIS, you know. So over a span of 5 years, I was in deep immersion schools where I would live in a city, you know, big city, and I couldn't speak English for 2 months. And I had two instructors a day. I had labs at night, and then testing along the way, you know, testing in class, testing after class, and things like that. But it just really kind of took off for me. And so I did reach fluency level, not as a native speaker, of course. But when I would travel to the Middle East, you know, I loved, you know, flipping that switch and using. And then when I was back working terrorism in the U.S., I used it pretty much if I was, you know, dealing with people who spoke Arabic. I mean, I did some interviews fully in Arabic, so I loved it. Spanish, I still don't understand it.
There you go. I took Arabic in college. It was the first semester year that Dartmouth offered both Arabic and Hebrew. So the first day of class, my professor came in, funny story. She was the daughter of the US ambassador to Saudi Arabia. So she had grown up or spent many years actually in Riyadh. And we all had to speak the first few words. And she turned to me, she said, "Which other languages do you speak?" And I said, "French and German." She said, "Ah, German." She said, "This will be a piece of cake pronunciation." Now,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
enjoyed learning the speaking part of Arabic. However, learning to read it was not easy. So I didn't pursue it. And then I found out when I moved to New York that the United Nations had Arabic and French as official languages, however, not German. So I sort of decided quickly I will not be working for the United Nations because I don't have two of the language requirements at the time. However, just, you know, working for the CFR in Middle Eastern studies and economics was just fantastic. In terms of your current career, I know that we've got a break soon. You're going on to Fox to speak about border issues. What advice do you have for those individuals listening, both in the US and overseas, in terms of the skills that they need to garner and expand to attain the level of amazing success that you have attained?
Yeah, I mean, I talk to a lot of people that are seeking to go in the FBI, for instance. So I'll have a friend of mine. Hey, my daughter is interested in becoming an agent or an analyst, and I always give them, very similar advice. I was an instructor at the FBI Academy for 2 years, and had a new class of 50 new agent, candidates, and I'd see who's there and who got in and things like that. And I know applications are up, according to Director Patel, I think greatly up. And so I always say, of course, you have to have a college degree to become an agent. But beyond that, I always say, take a very unique language, like wherever you can take it at college, in high school, outside of schooling. Take a very unique language. I don't recommend Spanish because a lot of people speak Spanish, and you want to look unique in a panel interview, with three agents. So I'll say take, one of the harder, more challenging, languages like Arabic or Farsi, Chinese, Japanese, something like that, Greek, something like that. I'll say, take a unique language so that people say, oh, that's interesting. You've learned, Japanese, for instance. And then I always say, get some travel under your belt, and if you can, go to unique places, go to austere locations, because again, when you're sitting and there's three, agents that you're talking to, and the FBI is out in all these different places nowadays. I say, not just the European, backpacking semester. That's great, but go to Kenya, and go somewhere like that. Go to Malaysia, right? Go somewhere that people say, well, that's interesting. The other
Yes.
thing I say is take a difficult degree, if you can. I took business, which was not that hard, right? But if you can take some kind of engineering, physics, something technical, that's going to make you stand out as well. And then the other thing I love to toss in there because I love Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I'm not that great at it, but I love it because I get to get a good workout in and hang out with some great people. But I'll say take some kind of martial arts, because again, when you go to the FBI Academy, you're going to be doing that for 20 weeks or however many weeks it is now. So those are just some things I say to folks aspiring to get into the FBI.
Wonderful. That's very helpful background information. And we will be producing a blog that accompanies this podcast. So those of you who want to delve into some of the links, I will also include links to the forensic accountant application. That was a big push for the FBI at our recent Association of Certified Fraud Examiners conference. And I had spoken to a few people, picked up brochures. So that's all online. I thank you again, Brig, for joining us today. This again is episode 4 of From the Hill to the Trenches, the Search for Justice. Thank you for listening, and we will speak with you soon.
Thank you for the time, Dorothy. I really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to From the Hill to the Trenches, the Search for Justice. I'm Dorothy Hill. Financial crime, or fin crime, may seem distant and abstract, but its effects touch all of us through market instability, compromised institutions, and eroded trust in our financial systems. If today's discussion has sparked your interest, there are ways to stay engaged. Visit our website, www.hill2trenches.com. That's number 2, hill2trenches.com, where you will find resources, extended interviews, and case studies mentioned in this episode. Follow us on social media at Hill Trenches, that's trenches plural, at Hill Trenches, for daily insights and breaking news in the world of financial integrity. Most importantly, share what you've learned. Greater awareness is the first step toward a more transparent financial system that works for everyone, not just for those who know how to exploit it. Until next time, remember, following the money reveals the truth, and truth is the foundation of justice. Join us again next week as we continue our search for justice in the complex world of global finance.